This is CNN. More people get their news from CNN than any other news source.
The mixed stand Wall Street as stocks struggle to find direction. With 1 hour left of trade, the Dow and the S&P 500 are both slightly up. Tech stocks are falling, and those are the markets. These are the main events. Sweden joins neighbouring Finland, announcing a plan to join NATO. Turkey could stand in the way. McDonald's is quitting Russia. The company plans to sell its restaurants and remove all use of its name and branding. COVID lockdowns wreak havoc on China's economy. New data showing a worse impact than expected. Live from the CNN Centre, it is Monday, May 16. I'm Linda Kincaid in for Richard Quest, and this means business. Good evening. We made it, Mr. President. The message to Volodymyr Zelensky from Ukrainian troops who say they've pushed through Russia's border north of the city of Kharkiv. The unit released this video, soldiers posing with a blue and yellow stake they planted to mark their gains. Kyiv says the focus of Russia's offensive is now in the city of Severodonetsk in Luhansk. Officials there say houses, a school and a chemical plant and a hospital were all hit by shelling on Sunday. Well, further south in Mariupol, Russia says it is evacuating wounded Ukrainian fighters from the Azovstal steel plant. CNN has not yet been able to verify that. Well, Sam Kiley joins me now live. Good to have you with us, Sam. So I want to start with those images we saw of a battalion of Ukrainian troops celebrating the fact that they've pushed Russian forces back across the border on the outskirts of Kharkiv. Just how significant is that?
Well, I think it's very significant symbolically because, of course, it's from that border that the Russian troops invaded back on February the 24th with the aim, clearly, of either encircling or capturing Kharkiv as they went to try to topple the government in Kiev. Neither of those two objectives have been achieved, and indeed the Ukrainians have driven the Russians back to their own baseland, if you like, back to the motherland. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not vulnerable to shelling from inside Russian territory. We've seen some of that conducted in that area and further west around Sumy, which is west of Kharkiv on the same kind of line of latitude. But I think ultimately this is also a sign, combined with the fact that the Russians in retreat blew up a lot of bridges northeast of Kharkiv as the Ukrainians were pushing towards that border crossing area, that the Russians have given up entirely on that front. I think we can anticipate, though, that they'll maintain some degree of pressure on the Ukrainians because they want the Ukrainians to be focused, as much of their troops there, unnecessarily fighting or defending themselves against the Russians, rather than in Severodonetsk, which I think is clearly now the main tactical, if not strategic, prize for the Russians over the next few weeks, Linda.
And Sam, I want to focus more on that Donbas region because it seems that there have been a significant number of Russian troops lost. Just explain what's happening in that region, particularly when we hear from the UK Defence Secretary talking about potentially a third of Russian troops lost.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, a health warning. The British are probably using the sort of statistics that they're getting from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are a belligerent in this war. I don't think anybody's got remotely accurate figures for Russian troop losses, except for those bodies that they find on the battlefield. And we can assume that the Ukrainians will, of course, exaggerate the levels of Ukrainian losses. But if we look at what's going on the ground, Linda, you can see very clearly that there is effectively something of a stalemate, particularly if you think that the Russians have been under orders to punch through Ukrainian lines, and they've been unsuccessful in that across pretty much the whole of this front. Yes, here and there they've captured some towns, mostly on, in a sense, the wrong side of the Donets River. Rybizny, for example, next door to Severodonetsk, has almost certainly fallen into Russian hands, although it's frequently contested on the fringes. There's been an attempt by the Russians to cross the river using pontoons. That, we know, was led to a military disaster, and we know from satellite imagery that they lost a lot, possibly 70 or 80 armoured vehicles, among them many tanks, and therefore one can assume large amounts of personnel were also killed in that action. And we also know that Severodonetsk remains in Ukrainian hands, notwithstanding, and I was there more than 2 weeks ago now, extremely heavy bombardments focused on areas such as the hospital and elsewhere, with the small numbers of civilians cowering in underground bunkers. So that's been the picture now for some time, with the Ukrainians holding their ground, hoping that the new NATO weapons that they're going to get will allow them to get on the front foot and start pushing the Russians back. And I think the Russian calculation will be to try to get some kind of battlefield breakthrough before those NATO weapons can be put to best effect, because when they do come, they must be concerned that they will be starting to get rolled back. But the Russians do have a numerical advantage. They have a vast potential source of soldiers. The Ukrainians have a finite resource of soldiers, and that, I think, is why the timing, the pace of this conflict is so important. The Ukrainians need it to go fast, and the Russians need to get their reinforcements together if they're ever going to have a breakthrough. Linda?
Such a great perspective from you, Sam Kali, for us in Kramatorsk, Ukraine. Thanks so much. Well, after decades of military neutrality, Finland and Sweden are on the verge of applying to join the NATO alliance. Today, the Swedish government formally announced its decision to seek membership, just a day after Finland did the same. The move was sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and has been condemned by Moscow. Sweden's Prime Minister says it's the best way to ensure her country's security.
Sweden will be very exposed during the time our application is being handled. Russia has said that it will undertake countermeasures if we join NATO. We can't rule out that Sweden will be the subject of disinformation and attempts at scaring and dividing us. But it is also clear that Sweden does not stand alone.
Well, Turkey, meantime, says it might oppose membership for both Finland and Sweden, accusing both countries of hosting Kurdish terrorists. CNN's Nina Dos Santos joins us now from Stockholm with more. And Nina, let's just start on that, because we did hear earlier from the US Secretary of State saying he believed there would be consensus when it comes to approving NATO membership for both Sweden and Finland. But Turkey has come out opposed to their applications. Explain why.
Yeah, that's right. Well, first of all, what we saw was on Friday, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, voicing some misgivings he had about the plans to allow Sweden and Finland into NATO. Remember that this has to be a unanimous agreement. All 30 NATO members have to agree, and Turkey has one of the biggest armies in NATO, so it has a big voice around the table here. It appeared as though after a weekend informal meeting of NATO diplomats in Berlin that some of those concerns had been assuaged, and then just today, as Sweden formally said that it would announce its plan to join NATO in tandem with Finland, Mr. Erdogan, President Erdogan, has yet again voiced his concerns in stronger fashion. What are his concerns? Well, he says that countries like Sweden and Finland, in particular Sweden, have given asylum to members of Kurdish separatist movements that he deems to be terrorist organisations. He also hasn't forgiven a country like Sweden for back in 2019 having pushed EU member states towards an embargo, an arms embargo on Turkey after it moved into northern parts of Syria occupied by the PKK and the Syrian arm of the PKK, which is the YPG, that Turkey deems to be a terrorist organisation. So for these reasons, Turkey seems to believe it has some diplomatic leverage here. Remember, this is a very tense time for these countries that are turning their back on decades of neutrality and military non-alignment, because they know that at some point they will be vulnerable over the course of the next year as that application to NATO goes in and has to be debated by all 30 of these countries. They're poised for Russian retaliation, and also, as you can see here, Turkey exercising some diplomatic leverage. The question is, to what end at this point? Linda?
Yeah, exactly. We will be watching this closely. Nina Dos Santos for us in Stockholm. Good to have you on the story. Thank you. Well, two major companies, McDonald's and Renault, are pulling out of Russia over the war in Ukraine. Their exit shows how fully the West is turning its back on Moscow. McDonald's was one of the first Western brands to cross the Iron Curtain. Its arrival in Moscow marked the end of the Cold War isolation. Cheering crowds welcomed its opening on January 30th, 1990. McDonald's says it served more than 30,000 Russians that day. The flagship stayed open late to satisfy the crowds. Well, meanwhile, car maker Renault's controlling stake in the iconic Soviet-era Lada came to symbolize the integration of Russia into the West's economy. Well, now Renault has reportedly sold its Russia unit, once valued at over $2 billion, for the symbolic sum of 1 ruble. Well, Anna Stewart joins me now for more on all of this. Huge developments. And let's just start with McDonald's. It suspended operations back in March, but now it's leaving Russia for good, and it's taking a big financial hit.
A huge hit. I mean, Russia is an important market for both of these companies. And as you mentioned there in your read, this is really symbolic because McDonald's opened just before the fall of the Soviet era. And it feels like it's really being bookended here with another big moment in Russian history where it almost hits reverse. Now, McDonald's had a very strong statement to say that certainly suggested it's not making a comeback in that market. It said it's selling down all of its restaurant portfolio to a local player. And it says the company intends to initiate the process of de-arching those restaurants, which entails no longer using the McDonald's name, the logo, the branding and the menu. And the statement goes on essentially to say that their commitment to the community around the world and their values just simply don't align with Russia's at this stage. They do not want their brand in Russia. That feels pretty final. The Renault statement was really quite interesting. They have decided to exit Russia as a market right now. They've sold down this huge stake in the Russian owner of Lada. They had a nearly 70% stake in that. But they have left their options on the table. They have got a six-year buyback scheme, essentially, where they can buy back into that investment within the next 6 years. Lots of different windows they could do that. It is a really important market for Renault. It's about 10% of their sales last year. And that's what businesses are really struggling with right now. So in March, we had the spate of companies, one after another, saying they were hitting pause in all their operations. They may be temporarily closing their doors. But now they're looking to exit. And they're taking hefty charges for McDonald's between $1.2 and $1.4 billion. Linda?
Wow, that is a huge sum. And then, of course, a big week for the EU. We may finally see the approval of that 6th round of sanctions. But I'm wondering, will the much debated oil embargo be on it?
I think even the EU is wondering that right now. We've actually just had comment from the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell. He says, unhappily, that was his use of term, they've not been able to reach an agreement today. I'm not sure that's particularly a surprise, but he did underline the fact that this Russian oil embargo is very much the sticking point. We had some optimistic tones from some other foreign ministers, including Germany's, earlier this morning, saying a deal is likely to be done this week in the coming days. But then we also had comment from Lithuania's foreign minister who said, and I'll quote this one, he said, the whole of the EU is being held hostage by one member state, which I believe is Hungary. So this 6th round of sanctions may get approved in the coming days. But I start to wonder whether the oil embargo will be on it. And if it's not, well, removing the biggest bank from SWIFT is something. Removing some Russian state broadcasters from EU airwaves is another. But really, none of that hits nearly as hard as a Russian oil embargo would. Linda?
Exactly. All right, Anna Stewart, we'll leave it there for now. Live for us from London. Thanks so much. Well, the exodus of Western brands is ramping up the pressure on Russia's economy. The new isolation, however, has very different risks to the Soviet-era self-reliance. Claire Sebastian reports.
Though often unreliable and always boxy, the Lada in the 1970s was a potent symbol of the Soviet Union's economic self-reliance. By 2022, a majority stake in the brand now owned by Renault, it was a symbol of Russia's global integration. That integration now unraveling because of the war in Ukraine and Western sanctions. Renault has announced it's selling its stake in Lada maker Avtovaz to a Russian state research institute, though with an option to buy it back within 6 years. Avtovaz announced in March it would have to redesign some of its cars to make do without foreign parts. Initially, that will mean no special features like anti-lock brake systems, according to one expert. And that's just the beginning.
If sanctions will be with us in future, we will have not new cars. We will be with just only used cars, in my opinion.
And it's not just the car industry in reverse.
Metals and mining, we go to chemical production, paper, textiles, even foods. Every industry is now either cutting their production by half or at least looking for the new ways to import and new ways to export.
Westernizing the economy was one of the hallmarks of Vladimir Putin's Russia. In the wake of the chaos and confusion of the 1990s, this policy helped bring prosperity, hope, and a real taste of something new. Now shutters and plastic sheets barely obscuring the remains of what was. Even McDonald's, which opened its first restaurant in Russia in 1990, says it's now starting the process of selling its business and, quote, de-arching its restaurants. Putin himself has played down the idea that his war and the resulting sanctions have undone 30 years of progress. The Soviet Union lived under sanctions, he said in March, and achieved colossal success. Rhetoric designed to strengthen his grip on power as he prepares Russia for a potentially painful economic transition.
The economy will adapt to the new situation. If we can't anchor one ship, we'll try another. If we can't go to one country, we'll go to a third country. You can't buy it here, we'll buy it in a fourth country.
In the Soviet Union and the decade that followed its collapse, economic isolation meant regular shortages of consumer goods and food. Queuing for things, a part of life. So far, Russia is not seeing this on a wide scale, but experts say it will if the war drags on. How much of a mess is this going to be, do you think?
I think this is the worst crisis that most people in Russia are going to experience in their recent history. So we invented the time machine, and it is the pain of the 90s, but the other way. We're going towards darkness.
The Cold War didn't just cement the Soviet Union's isolation, it also required ever-increasing defense spending, the true scale of which only emerged in its final years. Russia's hot war in Ukraine could deal a similar double economic blow. Claire Sebastian, CNN, London.
Well, Shanghai's government says things in the city will be back to normal soon. New economic data is casting doubt on that claim. The state of China's zero COVID policy next.
Hello everyone, I'm CNN meteorologist Tom Sater, and this is the Copernicus Climate Change Summary for the month of April 2022. Overall across the globe, we experienced the 6th warmest on record. Average global temperatures 1.16 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial period. There were some cool spots, northern Canada into the northwestern U.S., most of Europe, Central Europe, and very dry, looking at drought conditions persisting there. But warmer periods in Greenland, in western Antarctic, across northeast Africa into Southwest Asia. For the month of March, the mean daily temperature was the highest on record across northwest areas of India and Pakistan. But for the month of April, the average high temperatures were off the charts, looking at high temperatures in this region to be the highest in 122 years of record keeping.
Our mission is to see this young generation of leaders growing up make change in the world. My name is Edlira Debrani, and I'm the communications officer of Finnish School of Kosovo here in Kosovo, Europe. We created a wall of freedom, which is still in our halls. We organized a bake sale where we collected over 500 euros, which are going to be donated to an organization against domestic violence. I would say the one that we are most proud of is the Set in Stone Garden. For over a month, each student gathered rocks. We took these rocks, we wrote down our vows and pledges to end modern-day slavery, and then we took all those rocks outside in the middle of our schoolyard, and we spelled out My Freedom Day. So we had this really cool shot where everybody was shouting out My Freedom Day, sort of like a symbolic way to say that our pledges are actually set in stone and they will remain there forever. This, I believe, has made a very long-lasting impact on them, and it's something that they have vowed to actually take on in the following months. You'll see them around the school still doing other things for My Freedom Day.
New economic numbers from China show just how much damage was caused by the country's COVID lockdowns last month. Retail sales were down 11% compared to April last year. Economists were expecting a 6% drop. Urban and unemployment rose to 6.1%. Industrial production was down nearly 3% after growing in March. Some analysts now expect China's economy to shrink during the second quarter. Well, Shanghai's government says that city will return to normal by mid-June. But some people there are sceptical after enduring 7 weeks of lockdowns. CNN's Selena Wang tells us how far the economy has to go to get back to normal.
When the world's factory shuts down, it ripples around the globe. China's COVID lockdowns are jamming ports, choking off supply chains, increasing costs for companies. That leaves American and global consumers waiting longer to get their goods and paying more for them.
It is going to be a painful time on prices from goods that come into America from China. And that's a lot of goods.
Shanghai, China's manufacturing and financial powerhouse, now a ghost town. Unused factories have been turned into quarantine centers. In this one at the outskirts of Shanghai, medical trash bags are used to protect their beds from the rain. Some offices, now makeshift hospitals. The world's largest container port in Shanghai has been running at about half its capacity for more than a month. 1 in 5 container ships are now stuck at ports worldwide, according to Windward, and about 28% of the backlog is coming from China. Shipments from China to the U.S. are taking 74 days longer than usual, according to the Royal Bank of Canada, with no end to the delays in sight.
The orders will take a lot longer. If you thought it was bad in 2021, it's going to get worse in 2022.
At least 31 cities in China are under full or partial lockdown, impacting up to 214 million people. American companies from Apple to Amazon, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, and General Electric have blamed China's lockdowns for squeezing earnings. Foxconn, a major Apple supplier, temporarily halted production at its Shenzhen factory for a few days in March. Pegatron, an iPhone assembler, suspended operations in Shanghai and Kunshan plants in April. CEO Tim Cook said last month that China's lockdowns, along with the global chip shortage, could reduce quarterly sales by as much as $8 billion. But for small businesses, this is make or break it.
My last order that I shipped to the United States took about 4 to 5 months. We've went over a month without making any money as a business. We've also lost money from people wanting to place orders and not be able to ship them. I'm terrified. I'm terrified that Black Shades could be over.
Some factories have remained open by putting workers in a bubble, with staff working and living in the factory. Social media videos show workers at Apple and Tesla supplier Quanta jumping over factory gates, a mass of workers protesting COVID prevention measures in the factory, underscoring how hard it is to keep factories open. For decades, relying on China has kept prices for American consumers low. Now that might be changing.
There'll be short-term and long-term decoupling, things like zero COVID that could knock you over. So you've got to move some production out of China.
China's leadership is doubling down on its zero COVID strategy, despite the devastating impact on the country's economy. And a slowdown in China will be felt around the world. Selena Wang, CNN, Kunming, China.
Well, it is Biden versus Bezos in a Twitter feud over tax policy. The US president tweeted that wealthy corporations should pay their fair share of taxes to help bring down inflation. Jeff Bezos says corporate taxes and inflation are separate issues. The Amazon founder accused the US president of misdirection. Mr. Biden has in the past accused Amazon of not paying taxes. Amazon says its federal income tax bill in 2020 came out at $1.7 billion. That's roughly a third of the corporate rate. Rahel Solomon is following the story and joins us from New York. Good to see you, Rahel. So this war of words began over the weekend and it hasn't stopped.
It has not stopped. Good to be with you, Linda. Yeah, in one corner you have one of the world's richest men, and the other corner you have arguably one of the most powerful men. And at issue here is inflation, and that's because it is the economic issue in the U.S. right now as prices remain at 40-year highs. So let's start with a tweet just a few hours ago from Jeff Bezos tweeting, "Look, a squirrel." This is the White House's statement about my recent tweets. They understandably want to muddy the topic. They know inflation hurts the neediest the most, but unions aren't causing inflation, and neither are wealthy people. Remember, the administration tried their best to add another $3.5 trillion to federal spending. They failed, but if they had succeeded, inflation would be even higher than it is today, and inflation today is at a 40-year high. So that was in response to a statement from the White House this morning that said, in part, it doesn't require a huge leap to figure out why one of the wealthiest individuals on earth opposes an economic agenda for the middle class that cuts some of the biggest costs that families face and fights inflation. So, Linda, this war of words, if you can call it that, started over the weekend on Friday. And it started with inflation and would raising the corporate tax help lower inflation. It has turned today more so into the stimulus measures that Congress enacted here in the U.S. and whether that contributed to inflation, made inflation worse. And there is research to suggest that some of the stimulus measures we saw did add about 3 percentage points to inflation here in the U.S. That's according to, among other research, a report from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. So this war of words has escalated. Last tweet just a few hours ago. Remains to be seen sort of how it will end, Linda.
Yeah, exactly. And just quickly, Rahel, what is the reality in terms of how much the president can do to bring down inflation in the short term?
Yeah, you know, I asked an economist this a little bit earlier this morning who said this, said Bill Gaston of Brookings, saying that it's important to note that essentially President Biden can't do much in the short term to fight inflation, that this is essentially a job for the Federal Reserve. There's relatively little, Bill Gaston tells me, that either the president or Congress can do to affect the rate of inflation over the next 6 months. To that end, Fed Chair Powell knows that. He has said that it is his top priority. But, Linda, he has also said that it will likely include some short-term pain.
Yeah, no doubt. Nothing anyone wants. Rahel Solomon, good to have you with us. Thanks so much. Well, still to come in Ukraine, Russian blockades are preventing around 25 million tons of grains from making it to international markets. The United Nations warns a global food shortage may be imminent. We'll have more on this story next.
Innovate in association with ThoughtWorks.
Clearbot is a self-driving system that can identify random objects in the water. Clearbot then zigzags across the area that needs to be cleaned. The machine learning system is able to roughly classify it into what kind of waste it is. The robot basically goes up and down, collects up all the waste, and brings it back to shore. Our goal is to use technology to actually help decarbonize the ocean. The dream, the vision is that we have thousands of boats all over the world, making the ocean cleaner, greener, and better for humanity.
I'm Sam Kiley in Kramatorsk, and this is CNN.
Well, Europe's economic growth is expected to slow down amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Before the war, Eurozone GDP was expected to grow 4% this year. Now the EU is lowering that to just 2.7%. It also admits that inflation is set to spike as the war drives up energy prices and disrupts supply chains. The United Nations says staple foods like wheat and corn may start running out next year. Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports has prevented the country's crops from getting to market. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian officials are openly threatening the world with famine. He stressed that instability and economic costs a global famine could bring. With me now is Hosokli Makiyama. He's the director of the European Centre for International Political Economy. Good to have you with us.
Great to be here.
So Putin's war in Ukraine is now leading to a food and energy crisis. Major staples like wheat, cooking oil, sunflower oil, much of which comes from Ukraine and Russia, is no longer being exported. And they account for 1/10 of all calories traded globally. How is this war exacerbating a food crisis?
Well, first of all, the direct effect of Ukraine and Russia as major exporters of foods, and actually it's even more than 10% of all food traded measured in calories. We are looking closer to 12-13%. And the direct impact from their production that has been either ceasing or subject to export ban is going to have a significant effect. Ukraine alone is actually feeding 500 million people, accounting for 12% of global supply of wheat, 15% of its corn, and 50% of sunflower oil. And the secondary effect of this is, of course, increased prices that is affecting the commodity markets, as well as forcing governments who are afraid of either food shortages or inflation to take export restriction, in turn exacerbating the bad situation across the board. So we are looking at countries like India, as well as Indonesia, Turkey, Argentina, in short, some of the largest food producers that are usually called the regional breadbaskets in the region are actually taking active measures in order to restrict food exports.
And so what impact are those trade barriers having? And are we going to see other countries, more countries, follow suit?
Well, we have already seen 20 countries now taking measures that is effectively rising the food prices by almost 50%. And if you look at certain commodities like food oils, we are looking at even 150%. And in addition to that, we have impact on fertilizers, because there is now a global shortage of fertilizers that have actually led to another 30% of increases that will affect everything from your morning coffee to your late snack biscuit. So in other words, we are looking at a very long-term effect that will perhaps impact the global supply chain of food. And the World Food Programme is now estimating that additional 40 million people are now at risk of acute food shortages. So which is now, as the number up to 190 million people around the world could be actually facing starvation.
Wow. And it's not just that impact, right? You know, when we see a food shortage, it also can lead to civil unrest. We saw in Sri Lanka all those protests, the overthrow of the Sri Lankan leader. Talk to us about those other implications.
Well, this is the impact that we are seeing from not just from food shortages, but also from inflation. We need to remember that 1/3 of the consumer price index is actually made out of, or comes from food prices. And if we look to the recent political crisis we have seen, especially in the emerging markets, they have been caused by either farmers protest or food shortage, and usually they are interlinked. We are looking at, for example, the Arab Spring, as well as as you mentioned, the unrest in Sri Lanka. And the number one parameter, for example, that the Chinese leaders are constantly looking at is not necessarily GDP growth or employment. It's actually food prices, because that is the only thing that could lead to destabilization of the Chinese economy as a whole. So it is indeed a serious situation we are looking at.
Yeah, and one that is not going to end anytime soon. We'll have to leave it there for now. Hosokli Makiyama, good to have you with us. Thanks for sharing some time with us. Well, a mass exodus out of Cuba where people are desperate to leave economic misery behind. Cuban officials say U.S. sanctions are to blame for power blackouts, higher prices, and severe shortages of basic goods. Local people aren't so sure, though. Some say they made the decision to leave last summer after the government cracked down harshly on widespread protests. Well, Patrick Altman joins us now from Havana, Cuba. Good to see you, Patrick. So Cuba now dealing with runaway inflation, the worst shortage of food and medicine in decades.
That's correct, Linda, and the numbers really are staggering. Some 80,000 Cubans who arrived since October to the U.S., and that's only the U.S. You have thousands of Cubans that have traveled to other countries around the world, anywhere they can really get a visa to. And if this wave continues, it will be the largest exodus that Cuba has seen in decades. Wow. Cubans cross the Rio Grande from Mexico into Texas. It's a dangerous journey, and one happening more and more frequently as Cubans leave the island in the greatest exodus since the Mariel boat lift. Over 32,000 Cubans reached the border just in March, according to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. For many, the odyssey starts here, in long lines at foreign embassies to apply for a visa to depart the island by plane and then make the trip over land to the United States. Ever since Cuba's ally, Nicaragua, waived their visa requirement last November, the number of travelers has skyrocketed. Some told us the lack of food and medicines are driving people to leave. And why are so many people wanting to travel?
To buy things that we don't have here. We don't have the possibilities here to buy many things that there we can buy all these things.
The chronic scarcity has grown even more dire in recent months. The line behind me is for detergent to wash clothes, an increasingly hard to find item these days. Cubans certainly are no strangers to long lines and to shortages, but the economic freefall that this country is experiencing right now, many Cubans tell me, leaves them no other option but to try and leave. Cuban officials say the tanking economy is the fault of tougher U.S. sanctions.
Because in the case of Cuba, it's not just the consequence of the pandemic, it's the consequences of the reinforcement of the policy of maximum pressure, economic pressure of the U.S. Towards Cuba.
But many on this island blame the exodus on the government's harsh crackdown following last summer's unprecedented protests demanding food, medicine, and greater liberties. While the majority of Cuban migrants reach the U.S. from Mexico, an increasing number are also attempting the journey on homemade boats across the Florida Straits. Zuleidis says her husband lost his job during the pandemic and then lost hope. He was going crazy, she says. He didn't have the means to support us and our small child, and I think that's what caused him, the desperation, to throw himself into the sea. Zuleidis says her husband and nephew were on an overloaded boat heading to Florida that capsized. Their bodies were never found. It's heartbreaking because you can't say, I will move on or I will stop. You don't know anything, she says. Despite the peril they face, this new wave of Cubans leaving their island is unlikely to subside anytime soon. And Linda, the U.S. and Cuban governments did meet last month to talk about migration, the first such meeting during the Biden administration. And Cuba, of course, is pointing fingers at the U.S., saying that the U.S. Will not issue more visas here in Havana. The U.S. is asking Cuba to accept deportation flights, something that Cuban officials so far have resisted. And while all this finger pointing goes on, you see thousands and thousands of young, capable people choosing to go make their future somewhere else. People that Cuba desperately needs that are deciding that they do not have a future here and are leaving despite the costs.
Yeah, it's going to be a real brain drain. Patrick Ottman for us in Havana. Thanks very much. Well, that is Quest Means Business. I'm Linda Kincaid. I'll be back at the top of the hour as we make a dash for the closing bell. Stay with us. Up next, Living Golf.
It is forecasted that about 40% of the population in the world suffer from water shortages in 2050 due to climate change and population growth. And water is one of nature's greatest gift. So we decided to upgrade our water intensity by 50% and replenish more water than we use in our own plants globally by 2050. As a matter of fact, we've been working on this almost for 20 years by setting up a local watershed conservation and education for children. We are moving toward the international and global expansion. We want to raise awareness in the world that water shortages will come, and we have to be careful. We have to take action together. So we want to lead this initiative.
I want this show, One World, to be a place where people watching from all corners of the globe can understand why what happens in Africa has a huge impact on all of our lives in ways we might never even know. Because of my background, I am well aware of the vibrancy of this continent, and I want to show that to the world. People of my continent do deserve to be heard. We are rich in ways beyond the soil beneath our feet.
One World with Zain Asher, weeknights on CNN.
We share this place, we all belong. We have to restore this planet's soul. Teach it something more than what we know. Give it water, give it sun, room to grow. I can see a better tomorrow. I can see a better tomorrow.
Living Golf, in association with Gulf Saudi.
South Africa has historically been at the forefront when it comes to golf in Africa. On this month's Living Golf, we take an in-depth look at the game across the continent.
We take in the breathtaking views of Kenya's Vipingo Ridge Baobab Golf Course, where golf and nature converge like nowhere else in the world. Catch up with Trevor Immelman to look at the past, present and future of South Africa's best golfers. And sit down with Nigeria's Georgia Obo to see what it's like to be the country's first player on the Ladies European Tour. Welcome to Africa's only PGA-accredited golf course. The Baobab course at Vipingo Ridge in Kenya.
I think the interesting about is that everyone who plays it, they all say there's no hole that you sort of get. They're all different and they're all memorable. It's It's a good challenge, it's a good test, but it's not too difficult. It's fun.
Alongside top-tier facilities, golfers here join some unusual company.
It's such a nice thing to be able to go play golf and have wildlife just around you. You know, it's not false, it's not a zoo, it's just that's where they want to be.
This wildlife may seem to be at home, but it wasn't always this way. Originally a sisal plantation until 2004, it's since been transformed into a mixed-use development composed of residential and commercial properties, along with the course and wildlife sanctuary. Most of the animals living here are rescues, and in order to host these animals, the course had to prove it has space, capacity and food for the wildlife.
The Kenya government encourages more space for wildlife, and we encourage anybody who has large portions of lands to convert them into sanctuaries or conservancies. And one of them is Vipingo development here. The estate is 2,500 acres. They have allocated some 800 acres as a sanctuary and to have wildlife.
It's been a prolonged dry season this year, and the course has prioritized minimal greens watering to preserve water. And with the absence of predators, most animals are free to roam, munching on indigenous trees planted for their taste.
We try as much as possible not to control the movement of these animals and let them move on their own. We have a lot of bushes, let them go into the bush. We just allow them to be rewilded so that human interaction and that being close to human is a bit wears off a bit.
The animals aren't the only ones making themselves at home. At its PGA Academy, Vipingo Ridge brings top-of-the-line equipment to the next generation, training some of Kenya's top ladies youth players on site.
Technology in golf in the last 15 years has been dramatic, you know, the influence of technology, if you like. Understanding ground pressure, understanding kinematic sequence, understanding how to generate the most speed, which means you can hit the ball further, is, in today's game, it's key.
Looking to the future, this team sees opportunity to expand golf's reach.
Well, I think golf is growing in the region, and I think there's a general consensus that we need to involve more, a broader range of players. So starting with kids, for example, and the more people you embrace to come and try out, the more chance you've got of finding a champion, that's for sure.
As Kenya works to cement its place in the world of elite golf, Vipingo Ridge is looking to combine its future with conservation.
We have just introduced animals in Vipingo Sanctuary here, but slowly it can be a rescue center for also endangered species. For example, the Grevy's zebras are important because they're endangered in Kenya, they are few in numbers. So we want to encourage not only animals that are found in Kenya, but even animals that are being brought into Kenya which are currently endangered in our list.
Our intention is to create ultimately a breeding program where we can breed up stocks and improve gene pools with a view to then, in conjunction with KWS, reintroducing them either to the wild, into the parks, or to other sanctuaries and conservation areas like ourselves.
And moving forward, it's not just golf courses that can bring conservation to the fore.
Obviously, with the way the population is expanding, human-wildlife conflict is only going to go one way and get worse. So I think there's a lot of opportunity and scope for government to partner with developers, landowners who have land that they can commit to sanctuaries and conservation areas to create space for wildlife.
participate in the biggest tech and startup event in Europe. Follow international conferences with world-renowned speakers. Boost your business and generate 25% of your annual leads in just 4 days. Discover the latest technological innovations with positive impacts for businesses, the environment, and for society. Let's meet in Paris in June.
When thinking of golf development worldwide, the continent of Africa comes to mind as an untapped opportunity. And that's not just because of the sheer volume of land mass or population, but because of the heritage and legends like Bobby Locke and Gary Player. And among them, Trevor Immelman is constantly inspiring the next generation of South African golfers.
South African golf at its very best goes beyond what plays out in competition. Instead, it involves the passing of the torch between the country's greats.
And who was your immediate mentor, you know, as you were edging closer to becoming the champion that you dreamed of?
I had two, really. Fortunate to have two. First one is Gary Player. I met him for the first time when, you know, I was 6 or 7 years old down in South Africa. He was actually doing an exhibition at my home club. At this point, I'm 13 years old. I'm already a pretty accomplished junior golfer. And he invited me to play with him on the opening day of the golf course. And so our relationship really started to develop from that point. And the other one is Ernie Els. Kind of similar. He came and played an amateur tournament when he was still an amateur. He was 17 or 18 at the time in our hometown. And he was out Tiger Woods, really. And I just followed him around like a shadow. He must have been so sick of me by the end of the week, because I was never more than 2 or 3 steps from the guy playing this amateur tournament. So those two guys 100% paved the way, opened the doors for me, taught me really everything I know about the game.
After Immelman reached what many in the golf world consider the pinnacle of the sport with a win at Augusta National in 2008, he continued the tradition of nurturing homegrown talent.
So in many ways you opened the gate for the new generation of South African golfers, because you know there were a couple of great major wins not long after you. Surely they fed off what you achieved.
Absolutely. Those guys, after I won in 2008, they're 4 or 5 years younger than me. Absolutely, they were thinking the same thing. Hey, if Trevor can do this, I've played with him. I know that I can play with him. I've seen what he can do. Why can't I do this? I just need to believe in myself. Yeah. And you know, that's the kind of stuff you draw on as an athlete. You need to find little edges that you can build your self-confidence with when you're isolated and on your own out there competing.
Among those rising stars, 32-year-old PGA Tour winner Erik van Rooyen.
Now I've had the chance to play with Ernie. I've gotten to know Trevor really well, especially with him being the President's Cup captain this year. Yeah, it really puts a smile to my face knowing that I saw those guys on TV and now I'm sort of friends with them and playing with them. So it's an absolute honor.
While Van Rooyen played most of his amateur golf in the US for the University of Minnesota, coming home to play on the Sunshine Tour was what ultimately sharpened his game.
It's an extremely competitive tour, so that's one of the reasons why I sort of went back there. You know, I knew it was going to be tough to compete, and that's really what you want to help push you to get to the next level. So, you know, I spent 4 years away from home. My dad kind of urged me to go back. I really wanted to stay. I thought I was ready to play PGA Tour, but looking back, I wasn't ready, and I needed to go a different route, and going back to the Sunshine Tour, that was the best decision for me. Like I said, there's a lot of